Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for a conversation about child and family poverty and hunger in our city. My name is Melissa Wong. I'm Director of Engagement and Strategic Initiatives at Social Planning Toronto. What you'll hear today is that Toronto has reclaimed its title as the child poverty capital of Canada. It's not something that we want to boast about. Toronto touts itself as a world-class city and a place for corporate business and development. We are also seeing an alarming rise in inequality that has gone unaddressed. At Social Planning Toronto, we've been bringing together diverse groups of organizations, community leaders, and advocates for many years to drive action on solutions that address the root causes of poverty. We've been having these conversations about the path to end poverty with many of our community partners through the support of the United Way of Greater Toronto. Since the pandemic, however, the reality is that our communities and organizations are still struggling to recover. In today's political climate, we're seeing the necessity to change the narrative of what's happening so we can drive the solutions we all know are needed and to prevent the backslide of progress that we've all worked towards. Our speakers today will share the latest statistics, which sadly will not come as a surprise to many of you here. These are the realities that you see in the communities you live and work with. Today's numbers are grim, and while they don't surprise many of us, we are hoping that they will shock our governments into action. But we'll need your help. In today's event, we're going to start off with our speaker presentations, followed by a question and answer. And after the question and answer, we would like to have a discussion with you all about the solutions that are needed and how we can organize together to make them a reality. The next few years will be challenging. Already, we are fighting to hold on to critical programming and funding for the most vulnerable. But what we need is more and better, more funding and better programs to address the systemic barriers to ending poverty and hunger. To start us off, to share Campaign 2000's findings from the National and Ontario report cards on child and family poverty, I'm pleased to have Leila Sarangi join us. Leila is the National Director of Campaign 2000, End Child and Family Poverty, and is a senior leader at Family Service Toronto, responsible for the organization's nonpartisan public policy, social action, and government relations work. She leads the organization's equity and inclusion work at both the operational governance levels, and she currently serves on the board of directors of Childcare Now, Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Coalition. She is also the chair of the board of directors at Social Planning Toronto. Welcome, Leila, for today. I'll just share my screen. Just give me a moment to bring up Leila's presentation. Please go ahead, Leila.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Melissa, and to Social Planning Toronto for this convening, and to you for having me here in this space. I will talk about the latest findings of the national report card and the Ontario report card, just to give some context to where Toronto sits in the national and provincial picture. So the next slide. Next slide, Melissa, please. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so Campaign 2000 is a pan-Canadian coalition of over 120 organizations from across the country. We represent every province and territory, and we're backboned by Family Service Toronto. They're the host organization. And this coalition came about in response to this 1989 unanimous all-party federal resolution that to eradicate child poverty by the year 2000. So this year we're marking 35 years since that promise was made. The next slide. So in 2000, child poverty, instead of being eradicated, was almost at its peak. About 1 in 4 kids lived in poverty in the year 2000. You can see in this line graph, the bluish color, that teal color, is the national rate of child poverty from the year 2000 to 2022, and the purple line is Ontario, the provincial rates. And we can see here in about 2016, 2017, we have the first real significant reduction in rates of child poverty, and that was due to the implementation of the Canada Child Benefit. And then in 2020, when we had a global pandemic, a complete economic contraction, we actually had the lowest rates of child poverty, and that was due to the federal emergency pandemic response, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, the one-time top-ups to programs like the Canada Child Benefit, the Disability Tax Credit, the Canada Workers Benefit. Those programs had one-time top-ups, and what happened was it lifted people in the bottom of the income distribution up out of poverty, and we saw the lowest rates. But for the last 2 years, this is the headline of the report cards, we've seen the largest increases in child poverty on record, with Ontario outpacing not only the national average, but all of the provinces in terms of the highest increase in the last year we have data for. So nationally, we have about 1.4 million children, almost 1 in 5 kids living in poverty. And in the province of Ontario, that's about 550,000 children in Ontario living in poverty. On the next slide, I'll just quickly talk about the way that we're measuring poverty. We prefer to use the low income measure that's calculated with tax filer data. So anybody who filed for income tax in the year 2022 gets counted in that measure. It's a broad source. It's not universal, but it's very broad, captures quite a lot of people, and it's updated annually. And the threshold, the low income measure is 50%. So anybody who falls in the bottom 50% of that income distribution is considered to be living in low income, considered to be living in poverty. And that's how we get the number. That's that top line in this graph. The bottom line is the Canadian official poverty measure, which is the market basket measure. It's a consumption-based measure. It asks whether we can afford our basic needs. They cost out a basket of goods and services by region. And it tends to, as you can see, have this kind of a gap. It really does underestimate rates of poverty. It has a very small sample size, so it's subject to sampling error. A lot of people are excluded, including people living in First Nation reserves. There's preliminary releases for the territories, and it doesn't include anybody living in congregate settings, institutions, hospitals, jails, things like that. So it results in, you can see the discrepancy here, according to the official poverty line, 9.9, about 10% of kids live in poverty, representing 735 children, which is about half of what you get with the low income measure. And the concern is that those children and families who are not counted will not have programs in targets invested for them. So it's kind of why we prefer the use of the low income measure. On the next slide, this is, oh, you can go back one. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So this is child poverty under 18, comparing the provinces and territories to the national level. The teal, again, is those provinces and territories that are above the national average, which is most of the country right now. The green is those provinces and territories that are under the national average. And this really does speak to the importance of provincial and territorial work on poverty reduction. So every level of government does have an important role to play. You can see Nunavut, for example, has the highest child poverty rate, 42% almost. Of the provinces, Manitoba has the highest poverty rate, 27%, and that's compared to Ontario, which is 19.5. The lowest rates are in Yukon, Quebec, and BC. On the next slide, one of the indicators we look at is for children under 6. These poverty rates tend to be higher, and it's a concern. It's something we look at because experiences of poverty in those developmental years are very highly correlated with worse educational, health, social outcomes later on, economic outcomes later on in life, even if it's a brief period living in poverty. And you can see the rates tend to be higher. Again, the hot red is the provinces and territories that are above the national average. and the orange is below the national average. And Nunavut, we did release a Nunavut report card again this year with Amauti, the Nunavut Inuit Women's Association. You can find it on our website. 50% of the children live in poverty there, and their report card talks about how that's an underestimation of experiences of poverty in that territory. It's extremely high there, with, again, Manitoba having the highest rate of the provinces at almost 31% compared to Ontario, which is at 20.4%, which is still significantly high. The next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, every province and territory has seen significant increases over the last 2 years that we have data for in their rates of child poverty. This is the last year, 2021 to 2022. Nunavut by far had the highest increases, 6 percentage points for children under 18, almost 7 percentage points for children under 6. Ontario had the highest increase for children under 18 of all the provinces, and Newfoundland and Labrador had the highest increase for children under 6. Next slide. So government transfers like the Canada Child Benefit, the Canada Workers Benefit, those kinds of programs have a really important effect on the reduction of child poverty. They're really important. What this graph shows is that second set of bars from the left of the screen shows what the child poverty rate would be if we used only market income. Market income is employment income, self-employment income. It also includes money people make from capital gains and investments. But if we looked at the child poverty rates compared to using just market income, it would have been almost a third of children. The teal color is Canada's number, the purple is Ontario's number. So in Ontario, a full third of children would have been living in poverty looking at only market income. If we didn't have any government transfers, the rates would have been slightly higher. But those government transfers reduced child poverty rates down to about 18% in Canada, 20% in Ontario from that 1/3 mark. We look at the effect of the Canada Child Benefit on child poverty reduction, and on average, the Canada Child Benefit has reduced poverty rates by about 9 percentage points year over year. But in this last year, 2022, we have the lowest reduction on record. So it reduced child poverty in Canada from 30% down to 18%. But that is low compared to what we've seen in previous years. It represents about 580,000 children, so it's not nothing, but we've seen closer to 700,000 children in previous years being lifted out with that benefit alone. We have, in the last couple of report cards, looked at the effects of those pandemic benefits on child poverty rates, and in this last year, they were all expiring in 2020, and so they reduced the child poverty rates by less than half a percentage point in 2022. The next slide, please. What we also found in this report card is not only were more children living in poverty, their families were in deeper poverty. And what that means is that their family incomes fell further away from the low income measure. The gap that had to be closed was getting larger. And so this chart shows that depth of poverty by family type. So a lone parent with 2 children, this is the national rate of depth of poverty. The lone parent with two children is in the deepest poverty with a gap of almost $16,000, followed by a lone parent with 1 child, and then a couple family with 2 children and 1 child have slightly less depth of poverty, but it's still pretty significant, $13,000, $14,000 they would need to get to that threshold. And we know that even if you're making at the threshold, you're still not necessarily thriving. And I think that might be some of the stuff Sahar will talk about later, is that you can still have that income amount, but still face material deprivation. The next slide is the Ontario numbers, and it's following the same trends. So we'll just move on to the next slide. We look at family across child poverty rates across family types. Children who are under 18 living on their own. This is, young people who are leaving foster care, the child welfare system. They may be aging out of care or close to it, or they're leaving abusive households. They're usually young people under the age of 18, 17, 16, 15, 14. Almost all of them are living who file their taxes. Not everyone files their taxes, so the numbers are probably higher. They all live in poverty. I think this at the Canada level is about just over 52,000 children. In Ontario, it's about 16,000 children all living in poverty. It's a significant failure in our social infrastructure and support programs that all of these children who are filing their taxes, young people, are living in poverty. Lone parent families, also mostly women-led, also very high rates of poverty, nearly 1 in 2 kids growing up in lone parent families living in poverty, and that's compared to children in couple families where it's about 10%, 12% of kids in those families growing up poor. So some pretty wide discrepancies based on family type. The next slide. And we also saw income inequality, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. We look at the data of families with children, the gap between the top 10% of families and the bottom 10% of families just widening year over year, except again for that first COVID year where many from the bottom income spectrums were brought up. So we saw inequality close in that 1 year, but the last couple of years it's just been growing at a high pace. And you can see the top 10% of families with children own about 26% of income, the share of income, compared to 1.3, 1.4 at the bottom 10% of families. That top 10% of families with children have about as much income as the bottom 50% combined. The next slide shows what this means in dollar amounts. The average income for those families in that first decile, that bottom 10%, it represents about $14,000, $15,000 a year. That's the average income for that family, compared to the top 10% of families whose average income is, pushing $300,000. So just a huge income inequality gap. The next slide. And disproportionate, I don't think this is a surprise. These numbers, they are always devastating. Disproportionately high rates of child poverty for those in communities who are still experiencing systemic marginalization, the effects of ongoing colonization. We don't have great data. This stuff comes from the last census. So this does take into consideration those COVID benefits, which did positively impact groups from who were First Nations, who were young people, who were precariously attached to the labor market, had access because those COVID benefits were so low barrier to access. So even though, for example, First Nations children on reserve, their child poverty rates are nearly 40%. This is a COVID year, so that's kind of, I would say like better in air quotes than we might have otherwise seen. Still extraordinarily high rates of child poverty. The next slide. And for racialized children, again, also, this is the year capturing the year 2020, but still very disproportionately high child poverty rates for, racialized communities, especially those from Arab communities, Korean, West Asian, Latin American, Black, all really significantly higher than the national average. The next slide. And it also for immigrant children, particularly, so this graph is broken down by years of arrival. So particularly the newer immigrants who had arrived from 2016 to 2019 have a particularly disproportionately high rates of child poverty, to about 22% compared to non-immigrant children, and we're looking at 10%. So we can see some significantly, disproportionately high rates here. On the next slide. Oh, so then Campaign 2000 does have a platform. In the national report card, we put forward 58 recommendations this year. In the Ontario report card, I believe there was about 24, 25 recommendations, and we cover social and economic equity, income security for children and families, including a new benefit for low-income children. We have recommendations around indecent work and jobs guarantee for everyone. We put forward a model of a $0 to $10 a day national system of childcare, so that no matter what your income is or where you live, you would have access. Housing for all. We have many recommendations under designing and developing and investing in housing for families, and full Medicare. We've made some progress on pharmacare, but we're not anywhere near full coverage for essential medications, and community-based mental health services included in that. And just a couple of specific recommendations that I'll share as examples. So one thing we do talk about is updating the poverty reduction strategy, both at the federal level and the provincial level, with legislation committed to expedited targets of poverty reduction, leading to eliminating it at the federal level. We talk about eliminating poverty by 2031. With targets that are explicitly applied to those marginalized groups that face disproportionately high poverty rates, making sure that we're tracking that and including an indicator on reducing and eliminating deep poverty. One way to do that very quickly and very easily is a new supplement to the Canada Child Benefit that we've modeled with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And it's detailed both in the report, the national report card, and the alternative federal budget, so 2024, 2025. But to create a non-taxable supplement to the Canada Child Benefit that would be targeted to those families in deep poverty, broadening access to the Canada Child Benefit. Right now, there's some legislation and regulations that limit access for people with precarious immigration status, for children who are living in kinship care families or informal arrangements, for those in foster care. So removing some of the bureaucratic barriers around that. And this would, in its first year of implementation, could cut child poverty rates in half. And it would be easy to do because the administration is there. We know who these families are. They're filing their taxes. We know how to find them, how to reach them. It just really needs the budget investment, and it would be cheaper than the GST tax holiday that we're getting in a couple of weeks. It would cost less than what that is going to cost taxpayers. So something that could be done, I think, quite easily. And for the province of Ontario, we've been calling for, and this comes from Erwin Ellman, who's the former child and youth advocate, calling for a provincial nonpartisan all-party standing committee on children and youth to work across whole of government to create a new child and youth well-being action plan with budget lines attached to it. I think that's. Oh, and we do believe, we do believe as a campaign that poverty can be eradicated. It's not inevitable. It's not an economic necessity. We can, in a country as wealthy as Canada, actually eliminate poverty and create healthy, thriving, sustained communities. And the next slide, we've got QR codes that'll take you right to the report cards, but you can also find them on the website. And that's everything for me for now. So thanks very much. I look forward to hearing the other panels in the conversation.
Thank you, Layla, so much. I'm excited to hear more about the end of poverty supplement, and we'll also share out some of these links in the chat as well to make sure everybody has access to all of these, all of the reports. So next, speaking for today, I'm going to invite up Jinha. Jinha is our executive director at Social Planning Toronto. She has over 2 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector, with experience in community development, civic engagement, settlement housing, women's and 2S LGBTQ+ health. She currently sits on the executive of the Social Planning Network of Ontario. the steering committee of the Toronto Nonprofit Network, and the policy committee of the Ontario Nonprofit Network. Jen, please go ahead. We have your slides up.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks, Layla, for a tremendous presentation. It was really helpful to get the context both in Canada and in Toronto. And all your great work over the years, putting out a child and family report card every single year. We are an occasional child and family report card author. The last time we did one was back in 2018. So this seems really timely that we are putting out a Toronto-focused child and family report card, given the numbers that we've been seeing. And I think a lot of us who work in communities and or just live in communities, which are all of us, we have been seeing levels of struggle and poverty. We've seen the results of the housing and affordability crisis on the ground, and now we actually have data to confirm what we already know to be true on the ground. Although I must say that I think a lot of us were surprised at the actual numbers. So I want to present really devastating numbers similar to Layla, that follow really similar trends as the poverty, child and family poverty levels in Canada and in Ontario. But as Melissa mentioned at the top of this event, Toronto is the child and family poverty capital of Canada once again. We were before. We lost the title. At least last year, we lost it for 1 year. We've probably lost it in the past, but last year we lost the title to Winnipeg, and now we have the title again. And so some of the trends that we are seeing at the national and provincial level are even more stark in Toronto, which is quite unfortunate given that we are Canada's largest and wealthiest city. So I'm going to try to go pretty briefly through our key findings in our report. We we are looking at similar data, tax filer data, and looking at poverty levels in the same way that Layla talked about, which is looking at the census family low income measure after tax. So I won't explain that again, but I'll go right into our key findings. So our first key finding is that child and family poverty rates in Toronto, similar to Canada and Ontario, rose at record levels 2 years in a row. In 2020, the child poverty rate was 16.8% in Toronto, and it had actually been steadily decreasing like elsewhere since 2015. And again, this can be largely attributed to government interventions and transfers like the Canada Child Benefit and later to the CERB during the pandemic. But unfortunately, as you all know, CERB ended their temporary relief measure in the fall of 2020. And while imperfect, and we can talk about that, there's no doubt it contributed to a decrease in poverty rates when you look at the data. So really similar curve to national and provincial levels right there. That dipped down in 2022, and then the stark increase between 2020 and 2021, where we see a 3.8 percentage point rise to 20.6% in terms of child and family poverty levels. Single year greatest increase on record. And then the following year, we break that record from 2021 to 2022. We rise by 4.7 percentage points. It's to a point where in 2022, we have a child poverty rate of 25.3%. 1/4 of the population of our children in Toronto are living in poverty. And you can see that amounts to 117,890 people. So clearly, we're moving very quickly and very alarmingly in the wrong direction. Our second key finding, as we've already said, is Toronto has the unfortunate distinction, again, of being the child poverty capital of Canada. So again, that's 25.3%, and that's the highest child poverty rate among cities and regional municipalities with populations over 500,000. So in 2020, there were 81,000 or so children living in poverty. And by 2022, it was 117,000. So it increased significantly. And Toronto's rate is higher than the national rate of 18.1% and the Ontario provincial rate of 19.5%. Again, not a distinction that we celebrate, clearly. Our third key finding is that child poverty rates have been increasing in every single ward in Toronto since 2020. And once again, we're seeing similar patterns of poverty spread unevenly across the city's neighborhoods. Child poverty in 2022 was particularly acute and continued to increase within the inner suburbs of Scarborough, North York, and Etobicoke. There are 9 wards across the city with a child poverty rate of over 30%, and 4 of these 9 wards were in Scarborough. And the ward that both Family Services Toronto and Social Planning Toronto have our home offices in, Toronto Centre, has the highest rate of child poverty at 36.6%. And we saw the highest increases in child poverty in Scarborough North at 7.8 percentage points, Scarborough Guildwood, and Scarborough Agincourt. Now, I don't have a map to share with you today, but in the report, we also talk about and we look at poverty rates at the neighborhood level. We go down to the census tract level, which is a smaller geographic area than the ward level. And we show that there are 40 census tracts with poverty levels above 41%, going as high as 61%, which I believe is Flemington Park. Our fourth key finding, again, similar trend as nationally and provincially, half of all children in one-parent families live in poverty, and the depth of poverty is increasing. So in Toronto, again, we have a higher number than the national and provincial. We go over the 50% mark. 50.6% of Toronto children in one-parent families were living in poverty. And of course, we know that most of those are families headed by women and gender diverse folks. This rate is 3 times the rate of children in couple families. And we also know that many low-income families live in deep poverty, and that depth of poverty is increasing as it is elsewhere. The poverty gap, which helps measure the level of depth of poverty for one-parent families with 2 children in 2022, was, again, similar nationally and provincially. It was a whopping $15,495 below the poverty line. So that's the largest amongst all family types. What's interesting to note is the Social Planning Toronto played a critical role amongst in Toronto and with many of our partners to bring about Toronto's poverty reduction strategy in 2015. And while we have seen some decreases up until 2020 in poverty levels, the depth of poverty has grown considerably since 2015, so something to consider. I also want to mention that for one-parent families with 2 children in 2022, the child poverty rate was 2.4 times larger than it was in 2015. Our fifth and final key finding, again, not a surprise and aligned with what we're seeing elsewhere, Indigenous, racialized, immigrant, and newcomer children, as well as children from non-permanent resident households, have some of the highest rates of child poverty in Toronto, alongside those in one-parent households. So despite being such a highly diverse and racialized city, Toronto, like the rest of Canada, continues to generate inequitable opportunities and resources for Indigenous, Black, racialized, and immigrant populations. So Indigenous children in Toronto had a poverty rate of 20.4% compared to 14.5% for non-Indigenous children. And this gap is most likely even larger as the census, as we all know, undercounts Indigenous people and other hard-to-reach populations. Racialized children had nearly double the poverty rate of non-racialized children, and children from specific groups, including Arab, West Asian, Black, Latin American, Korean, and Southeast Asian children, had even higher rates. Immigrant children had a poverty rate of 21% compared to 12.6% for non-immigrant children. And when we looked at children who immigrated with their families in 2020 and 2021, so the most newcomer children, they had a rate of 38.1%. And children from non-permanent residents had a poverty rate of 42.6%, double that of immigrant children, and almost 3.5 times the rate of non-immigrant children. And while more research is needed on the poverty rates amongst people with disabilities and the 2S LGBTQ plus communities, available data does show that people with disabilities have a poverty rate likely double that or more of individuals without disabilities, and that non-binary and transgender people have higher rates of poverty than their cisgender counterparts and the national average, and almost 1/4 of the youth experiencing homelessness in Toronto identify as 2S LGBTQ+. So I'll talk a little bit about what we need to do in terms of taking action going forward, and would love to go into more details in a discussion with all of you following the presentations. Alarming numbers, but it's a call to action, as we're all saying. This data proves beyond a reasonable doubt that we are not doing enough to address poverty and child poverty, and that we must take urgent and bold action moving forward. And all our respective reports also show that it is really possible to meaningfully tackle, reduce, eradicate child poverty if the political will is there. So our recommendations fall under 3 key areas focused at the municipal level. We, of course, endorse and support all the recommendations in the national report card and the Ontario report card as well. All 3 levels of government play a critical role in addressing and tackling poverty. We talk about the need to, first of all, guide all actions with a human rights-based approach and an intersectional gender equity approach. And so that looks at basic needs and affordability and the right for every individual to live free from poverty, enshrined in international human rights law, and obligating governments to meet those rights. So we talk about things like the right to adequate housing and shelter, the right to adequate food, the right to work, and other related economic, social, and cultural rights. So that's one critical approach. The second key piece, I'm kind of combining the last 2 slides, so you could probably go to the next slide, is around an approach to ensure livable incomes and inclusive economic development practices, where we aim to redistribute income, wealth, as well as decision-making power while moving structural barriers. So our recommendations in this realm are centered around things like using existing and inclusive planning tools, such as Toronto's community benefits agreements and things like social development plans that exist in different parts of Toronto, to protect low-income neighborhoods facing development against displacement and gentrification. It includes things like providing access to decent work opportunities and livable wages for sectors dominated by, for example, racialized and immigrant women that work in the care economy, such as in shelters, childcare, and other community services. It includes recommendations around significant improvements to the childcare system, including increased funding and requiring the building of childcare centers and new housing developments, alongside a recommendation for a capital loan fund to support new nonprofit and public centers in particular. And then our third area of recommendations center around addressing systemic inequality by prioritizing key communities due to colonialism, racism, and other institutionalized forms of discrimination. Poverty is distributed unequally across Toronto's geography and across our sociodemographic communities. And so it's critical that we have targeted recommendations and actions to address and reverse that inequality. And we pull a number of the key recommendations at the national and provincial level that Campaign 2000 has identified with their partners, and really push for the municipal government to align with some of those targets around reducing and eliminating poverty as well as homelessness. And then, a critical part for us as well is ensuring that local government and all levels of government are partnering with and recognizing the strength of the community and the community services sector, including in looking at a robust monitoring and evaluation system going forward. And we really, really want to see a renewed commitment and new bold investments and targets in a third-term action plan that has been delayed multiple times under the city's poverty reduction strategy. So I'll leave it there, and we can have more of a conversation after Sahar. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jen. Both you and Layla are leaving me with a little bit of hope as we go through these pretty stark numbers. So I'm really pleased to welcome Sahar Raza next, who's going to share the details of the 2024 Who's Hungry report, which is put together by Daily Bread Food Bank and North York Harvest, and captures the data across Toronto. Sahar is the Vice President of Research and Advocacy at Daily Bread Food Bank, and a board member at Oxfam Canada. She has been leading research, policy, and communications initiatives on issues ranging from bias and artificial intelligence to poverty, discrimination, and homelessness for over a decade, and has seen advocacy wins at local, national, and international levels. She previously served as the Director of Policy and Communications for a national network dedicated to advancing the fundamental human right to housing in Canada. Welcome, Sahar.
Oh, thank you folks for having me. Can you see my screen? Fantastic. I just want to share the slides. All good? Great.
We're seeing the presentation version, the presenter version.
Oh, strange. I am not sure how to undo that. So can we just...
If you're good, we're good.
Okay, sounds good. Unless Saroja wants to share the slides, but I'm fine with this. Oh,
Here we go.
awesome. Thanks. Great. All right, folks. Thank you, folks, for having me here, and really appreciate Layla and Jin's presentations. I'm certainly just going to build and refer back to those because we're seeing similar trends at food banks. But what I really want to share through our Who's Hungry data is a portrait of food insecurity and poverty based on what we're seeing at the front lines at food banks as recently as 2024. So our Who's Hungry report is an annual portrait of food bank clients and food bank numbers. It's done in collaboration with North York Harvest to offer a holistic citywide portrait. And it comes from over 290,000 clients intake data, as well as 1,400 surveys, 10 in-depth interviews, and all of that is done across 8 languages. So it really is a representative sample of who we're serving on the front lines. So to dig in, what are we seeing and what are the numbers? Well, it does pain me to say that we've had another record-breaking year of food bank visits. We served 3.49 million client visits in just 1 year in Toronto amongst our food banks. Just to explain the scale of that, it took us about 38 years to hit 1 million food bank visits. Then it took 2 years to hit 2 million in 2023. And then it took just 1 year for us to hit almost 3.5 million visits. So that's a 273% increase compared to pre-pandemic. And what it really tells us is that we're seeing this exponential scale of growth since the pandemic, right? Everyone thought pandemic is when food insecurity is the worst, but actually it's only gotten worse. And we often say that every food bank visit is a policy failure because we know that we're not the solution. We're just the emergency band-aid that people come to when they've exhausted all other resources. And so these numbers really just tell us that our social safety net is crumbling, as our previous presenters have referred to. Now, when we look at what that looks like as a proportion of Toronto's population, we're now at more than 1 in 10 people in Toronto who rely on food banks to survive. That's up from 1 in 20 just 2 years ago. And again, this is extremely concerning because, as I've said, people will do everything that they can before they cross the threshold of the food bank. They're going to borrow from family and friends or go into debt to put food on the table, make difficult choices between medication and food. And so if they're actually coming to the food bank, that's because they've exhausted all other resources and they truly are in an emergency situation. So we know that it's much more than 1 in 10 who are actually facing food insecurity. In fact, I think national numbers are about 1 in 4 at this point. And it's not the same clients that we've been seeing historically. Actually, we've seen some interesting demographic shifts concerning because we're now seeing folks from truly every demographic coming to food banks. And in fact, about half of our clients, more than half, 57%, are new, which means they came to a food bank for the first time in the last 12 months. So what that is now amounting to is about 13,000 new clients walking through our doors every single month. These are people who never thought they would have to come to a food bank, who are now coming to rely on our emergency services because they have no other option. And that's 4 times what we saw just 3 years ago in 2021. So who are these clients? Of course, as I mentioned, it's a cross section of all populations, but certainly there are certain groups that are overrepresented. So 1 in 4 of our clients are people with disabilities. This has always been the case. They've always been overrepresented because we know that social assistance rates are woefully inadequate for people with disabilities. They're kept $1,000 below the poverty line. And so, of course, many of our recommendations in this report do have to do with scaling up ODSP rates and ensuring a really robust Canada disability benefit to at least bring folks to the poverty line. And actually, when it comes to child hunger, households with disabilities have twice the rate of child hunger compared to all of the other households. So I know Jen mentioned we don't have a lot of data on that group, but from the food bank data, we do see that they're much overrepresented. In terms of other groups, about 80% of our clients are racialized or mixed race. So I think this came up in the past presentations as well. That's a way overrepresentation compared to Toronto census data. 80% of our clients are renters. That's compared to 40% of Toronto who rents. So again, really speaks to housing precarity that's uniquely felt by tenants in the housing market, which I'll dig into shortly. We have some new data that 30% of our clients are students. We've never looked into this before. I'll dig into that a little bit later because it speaks to a host of issues with international students, with lack of employment opportunities for young people, lack of student housing, et cetera. But certainly something concerning for our future generations when we think about them coming to food banks. And then there's also some unexpected findings, I think, for folks who maybe don't think too deeply about poverty, because about 60% of our clients have post-secondary degrees, and almost half of our clients are employed or have some form of employment income. So these are people who have followed that path that we're all told to do, go to school, get a good job, you'll be fine. And actually what we're finding is that they're not fine. They're still getting trapped in poverty. And so I'll dig into that shortly as well. But lastly, wanted to just raise, I know we're focusing on children, that 1 in 4 of our clients continue to be children. This is consistent from past years. But something for us to note is that the frequency of food bank visits amongst families with children is much higher than it was pre-pandemic. So something, again, has broken such that the depth of poverty that these families are facing is much deeper than it was pre-2019. And that's similarly felt amongst people on social assistance, people with disabilities, people who are unemployed. Digging into new clients, because again, I mentioned that's 57% of our clients. Over half of new clients are actually employed or have someone in their household who is employed. And I'll dig into some of those stats shortly, but they're working an average of about 35 hours a week. They're making more than minimum wage. So really, it's quite unacceptable that they're still not able to make ends meet. I also mentioned some of the stats on students. About a third of our new clients are particularly are 2 in 5 are students, but a third of our clients also skew young. So they're actually 18 to 29, which again raises concerns for the opportunities that we're presenting for the next generation. About 4 in 5 of our clients are newcomers. I believe Jen spoke to this quite in depth, but the takeaway here is that the government of Canada is really relying on newcomers to fuel our economy. About 97% of our population growth comes from newcomers. We're bringing in newcomers to fuel all of our essential services like healthcare, the food sector, et cetera. But we're increasingly relying on temporary migrants as opposed to permanent immigrants and folks with PR. And we know that temporary migrants don't have access to the same social security supports and so on. And so as a result, they're really not being set up for success when they're brought into Canada. So not only does that have human rights implications, but it also means that we're not even gaining that economic value that we think we are from inviting newcomers to Canada. And finally, a quite surprising finding was that our unhoused clients increased by about 420%. And we also saw a 90% increase in folks from emergency shelters. And the reason this is surprising is because food banks provide groceries. So it's not something that folks who are unhoused would typically be able to use. We do offer hot meal services, but those are not captured in this report, so we're not reporting on that data. So what this data is telling us is that likely folks are just experiencing homelessness for a more sustained amount of time, and they really just need some sort of secure, reliable source of food. They may also be, refugees in hotels or folks in encampments who actually have some sort of cooking utensils to be able to utilize what we're able to offer. So that's something to think about, certainly. Now, what is feeding these food bank numbers? I mean, I've touched on the issues, but broadly speaking, it's exactly what you would expect. Incomes are just not keeping up with the cost of living. And more than unemployment, more than being new to Canada, 60% of our clients listed the cost of living as the main reason that they're coming to food banks. Because even with an income, either through social assistance or through employment, they're at about $1,200 for median monthly income, which is about half of the poverty line in Toronto. And so they'll do everything they can to find the most affordable rental housing on the market. Many of them are living in multi-tenant housing, intergenerational housing, overcrowded homes. And still, after paying rent and utilities, they're left with a median of just $7.78 per day, which is about one ride on the TTC, and you're left with $1 per day to pay for groceries, clothing, literally everything else you need. So that's just not adequate. And we're finding that housing is the biggest pain point for our clients. So about 9 in 10 clients are living in unaffordable housing, according to the Government of Canada's own core housing need definition of unaffordability. And 1 in 5 of our clients are spending 100% or more of their income on housing, which means they're likely going into debt. They have literally no money left for anything else. And this is likely driving the rise in homelessness that we're also seeing, because you're at very high risk of homelessness if you have literally no money left after rent. But we find, of course, with rent being an inflexible cost, it's always the thing that eats first. That's why this title is Rent Eats First. So people are going to pay rent, and then there's literally nothing left, which is driving up our food bank use numbers. Why is this happening? Well, we're seeing the worst numbers amongst the private market renters, and that's because rents have increased by about 54% over the last decade. There's many reasons for this. So, for example, rent control being repealed after 2018. There's also a lack of investments in deeply affordable housing. So we lose about 15 affordable units for every one new affordable unit that is built in Toronto. That is extremely concerning because every level of government claims to be building affordable housing, but we just don't have the right rent regulations in place to actually preserve what we even have, let alone catch up and build new. As a result, the average cost of a one bedroom is about $2,400 today in Toronto. As I mentioned, our clients are making an average of about $1,200. So there's no way that they could ever be able to afford a new housing unit that comes onto the market. And the Canada Housing and Mortgage Corporation has, in fact, said themselves that there are statistically zero rental units that would be affordable to people with the lowest 20% of incomes in Toronto. So that's obviously a large chunk of the people that we are serving. And it's very concerning that our governments know that there are no affordable units for this population. And yet we're still not really prioritizing deeply affordable social and government-run housing. And so we have many recommendations in this report about scaling up that level of deeply affordable housing, not just market housing. When we look at other expenses, I'll just very quickly share. Of course, we all know that grocery prices have also increased. The graph on the left here shows that grocery and food prices increased at a much higher rate than all other items over the last couple of years. And so even when people say, well, inflation is down, of course, that doesn't change the fact that prices are where they are, and people have to contend with the new reality that groceries have gone up so much. And so what we've done in this year's report is actually map how food prices affect food bank visits and have seen a direct correlation as prices have gone up. So food bank visits, I'll say that so did housing prices went up at the same time. So it's kind of a, a combo of both housing and food going up, leaving folks to really have to rely on emergency services. And then quickly, just to run through the income side of the spectrum, I don't need to belabor this because we all know this, but wages are just not enough. As I mentioned, about half of our clients have someone in the household who is employed. They're making more money than they ever have before, over minimum wage. They are working almost full-time hours, and still they are not able to make ends meet. About 55% of them also rely on precarious work and don't have any sort of benefits, which obviously leaves them even more precarious. And again, making those difficult choices between, say, medication and food. And just to speak to the youth element for a moment here, youth unemployment is at an all-time high, or 10-year high rather, of 13.5%, and especially even higher in Ontario. And what's extra concerning about these numbers is that youth, young people, newcomers, they're the least likely to be able to access EI when they are unemployed. So that's leaving them in these very precarious situations where they're not even being able to access these most basic supports. And finally, when it comes to income security, we know that 3 in 10 of our food bank clients rely on social assistance, and these numbers are just woefully inadequate. OW rates have not increased since 2018. They're at about $700, almost a quarter of the poverty rate or poverty line. And we know that ODSP rates are still going to be $800 below the poverty line even after Canada Disability Benefit is implemented. So we're really calling for all of those income supports to be increased to enable people to live a life of dignity. And so last, just want to end here with calls to action. We actually asked our clients this year what policy change they would need to see in order to be able to stop using food banks. And it's exactly what we would expect. They want more affordable housing, raising the minimum wage, more newcomer supports, better job training and job hunting, and of course, increasing social assistance benefits. And so I won't go through all of our recommendations, but I'll flag that we have 6 recommendations for every level of government that dig into these exact areas. So, supporting, ensuring that people with temporary status are made regular or given regularized status, launching automatic tax filing for Canadians, because we know that so many low-income people don't file taxes and then don't even get access to the benefits that they're entitled to, and so on. So there's recommendations for every level. I just wanted to flag that we do have a letter writing campaign on our webpage, dailybread.ca/take action, where you can email every single level of government to call for these recommendations to be implemented. And we also have a campaign at fundthebenefit.ca, which is specifically focused on the Canada Disability Benefit because it is still in development. So we're hoping that the federal government will make it more robust to support people with disabilities. And so that's where I will leave us.
Thank you so much, Sahar. That's really, really great calls to action, but really, really stark and frightening numbers as we are seeing